guys. So this week's discussion is on anthropology, functionalism, and colonialism. And I'd like to kind of start with the definition of functionalism based on my understanding of the readings, and this largely comes from Evans Pritchard and Radcliffe Brown. My understanding of what they mean by functionalism is that it's the way that a society comes to function based on their social and political structure, and that comes from the understanding that culture is a social organism, and a social organism is supported by a structure that is then comprised of smaller units, and these relate down to the social organizations, the levels of society, starting with the individual, and then I would assume it would be the household or the family unit, and then it would be, one's immediate neighbors or one's kin, extended kin, and then it would be the larger community, and then, in their terms, the tribe or the regional sense of power and power structure. And so that's my understanding of what they mean by functionalism, is that it really is an exploration of how societies work. And that was a huge aspect of colonial or post-colonial anthropology, was, trying to come up with a very clear definition and understanding of what makes a society that is not European function, because there was this underlying assumption that European society, European politics, European economy was sort of the epitome of human achievement, and that anything that was not European in nature was somehow lacking or was more primitive. And so there was this assumed knowledge gap that we had to go out and find or figure out how these societies were functioning, because, they're not European. How could they possibly work? So that, I think, is a huge underlying assumption, and that's a huge problem in this era of anthropology, is that there are some underlying assumptions that direct the hypotheses, the direct research, that are not challenged because there's just this sort of inherent bias. And it's really hard at that time, if that's the environment that you're surrounded with, to be able to take a step back and say, the work I'm doing, the assumptions that I'm making, the analysis that I'm applying is not, is highly biased, is ethnocentric, because it's hard to sort of know our unconscious assumptions that we make when we go into analyzing a situation. So I think that's a huge part of some of the problems of this era. And the other problem, too, is that a lot of anthropologists at this time were funded by, the British government, who wanted an exploration of local governments so that they could more easily maintain and regain power. And so there was this ethical issue of, anthropologists are going in and they're studying these cultures, and then they're handing that information over to the British to enable the British to continue to control these local people. And so that was highly problematic. In the Evans Pritchard reading, one of the huge problems, and this goes back to what I was saying about having underlying assumptions, is that he makes this broad, universalized statement that the newer people represent all of East Africa, which is hugely problematic in so many ways, not the least of which because it completely ignores the nuances of any other group of people who live in that area. And they may very well be the epitome of what society is like. Every other group of people in East Africa may very well behave the exact same way as the newer people. But because he doesn't ever provide evidence for those other tribes, then it becomes problematic, because it's a generalized or universalizing statement that sort of ignores the inherent cultural complexity. The other thing that was a little bit problematic to me is that he refers to the newer people as an anarchic state. And at first I thought that he was trying to imply that that it was anarchy, that they did not have social order, that they lacked control, they lacked structure. And in reading, I think his point there more was that they don't have a centralized power structure. They are non-hierarchical the way that you would find in a European society. And that again goes back to this Eurocentric idea of what a society is or what it should look like. The other thing that struck me is how he goes through and he's trying to define how their society works. Again, that idea of functionalism. How are they functioning? How does it make sense? And he's using, he makes the statement, what is the newer tribe? And he kind of goes on to say that you have to make that definition because the newer people don't fit that time's understanding of what a tribe looked like. And so in one statement, he makes the comment that they are atypical, and then almost in the very next sentence, he makes the comment that they still are representative of a huge geographic region. And that, again, sort of highlights the problematic assumptions that are underlying a lot of the field work at this time. Let's see. I will say, though, that it's unfair to sort of go at this with a blanket condemnation, because to be fair, Evans Pritchard did do pretty extensive fieldwork, and this is kind of like Bronislaw Malinowski, who behaved sort of with some racist ideologies, but he still collected the raw data. He still made the observations. He still made the connections. And so his ethnographic work in that sense, I don't think Evans Pritchard and Malinowski, I don't think were incorrect. The problem comes in the analysis and in sort of the presentation of the data as just further evidence that these societies are primitive and less advanced and not as idealistic as they could be, i.e. they're not European. Evans Pritchard, in his concept of functionalism, also draws heavily on Radcliffe Brown's idea of the social organism. And Radcliffe Brown kind of makes the comparison of a social order, social organization, to a living organism, a molecular structure. And so he likens the components that make up a structure, like the cells, the molecules, to the units that comprise a larger whole, and then that structure sort of supports the organism, but the organism is not defined by its structure. It transcends the structure. And in that sense, this is sort of an effective working idea of what a culture is, just because we can see that there are these social, political, and economic structures that perpetuate certain societies, certain cultural ideals, but that the culture itself absolutely transcends that, especially when you have the consideration of individual agency, individual autonomy, the behavior of small groups of people, and of course changes over time. And so that, again, points to culture as sort of this living organism that is beyond the structures that comprise it, but the structures are still necessary for it to function. The attempt to understand how cultures work, how societies work, is sort of then perpetuated in Stewart's article, The Patrilineal Band. And his goal here is to sort of develop a series of laws that all cultures abide by. So it's a formula for establishing and determining what culture is. And this again goes back to my first point of there are a lot of unconscious automatic assumptions that inform the way data is understood and analyzed. And it's going to give you an inherently biased answer just because you are sort of looking for, you're only interpreting the data within a certain lens. And recognizing that is incredibly difficult. It would be unfair of me, I guess, to say that they should have done better, they should have been less biased, because the pressure of the sort of social mores of the time is going to absolutely determine how people's perspectives are shaped. That being said, one of the themes that comes up a lot in these readings is this sort of deductive reasoning, where a lot of these researchers have a hypothesis going in, and then as they do their research, they are looking for the data which best supports those presupposed ideas, the presupposed hypotheses, the notions, the preconceived notions about what a given society, a given group of people are going to be like. And there's a tendency as such to sort of ignore the implications of data that doesn't fit those trends. And a good example of this is in Stewart's article, he's talking about the patrilineal band, how societies will always tend to become a male-dominated culture. If culture were removed, organically humans would again develop in the exact same way with a largely male-dominated hierarchy, and that would be a global, universally seen trend. And the problem with that way of thinking is that one, there's a biological assumption that men are inherently superior to women in terms of their ability to be communal leaders. The other thing that is problematic is that he has this assumption that all societies are inherently patrilineal, and therefore is not looking for examples of matrilineal or maybe a more egalitarian society where there's a higher equivalency between the status of men and women. And so he's going in with this underlying assumption, and then his data and all of his research is geared towards satisfying that assumption. And that is the inherent problem in a lot of these perspectives. I think his intentions here are noble. I mean, his goal is to sort of try to set a baseline in which, or from which, a lot of different societies, a lot of different cultures can be compared. But again, there's inherent problems in the application of those laws, especially if you set the bar in such a way that only certain cultures are then given value. And that largely goes back to supporting the concept that European cultures were superior to primitive cultures or non-European cultures. And when I say non-European, I mean everywhere basically except for Europe and the United States, because there was this concept that the United States was sort of a byproduct of Europe, and that we are inherently European, which is not the case. So lastly, in White's article, he is kind of continuing on with in the same vein that Stewart was in his article, where he's attempting to define culture. And I think this concept of what is culture has sort of been chasing anthropologists for the entire history of the discipline. I don't know that there's a universally agreed upon definition that everyone accepts perfectly and completely. There are some definitions in various schools of thought that are accepted, but there's not one universal definition. So I think all of these articles are in the same vein of attempting to define culture. And White in particular is going on by saying that culture has two particular components. The first is that culture comes from within human thought, human ability. The second is that culture is a response to our need for access to external resources. So there's an internal and an external component to culture, and that it's the interplay between those two that then defines what a given sociocultural environment is going to look like. That being said, that White goes on to kind of incorrectly apply Darwinian evolutionary theory. And I say it's incorrect because he's saying that it's like the theory of evolution, but his underlying conception is far more Lamarckian in nature, and Lamarckian evolution is sort of this progressionist understanding that all living organisms are moving towards some pinnacle of achievement, and that pinnacle of achievement is humanity and humanity's social and political roles. And so And obviously that is not the case. Every single species on the planet is sort of an independent example of themselves, and they can only be looked at in their own context. They're not all moving towards being the exact same. They are adapting based on their needs, their ability to perpetuate fitness, heritability, and variation. And so White's application here of saying that culture evolves because all life is trying to be more secure, trying to be richer, trying to advance the species, trying to produce better and more effectively, to survive better, to transcend sort of a basic level of survival and be so much more than that, go beyond that. And so that is this very progressionist view, and it's a misunderstanding of applied evolutionary theory. And so it's kind of this interesting dichotomy of trying to support a particular perspective by justifying it one way and yet not actually adhering to the principles of that particular justification. And again, to bring this all back, and I know I keep reiterating this point, but to bring this back, human assumption, human perspectives are to a certain extent culturally informed, enculturated in us, and that will always, I think, have a certain degree of bias, a certain degree of ethnocentrism in it. But doing our best, I guess, to try to take a hard look at when we are being biased. What does bias look like? How can we counteract bias? That, I think, ultimately is the goal, especially in the social sciences, where bias about differing perspectives, beliefs, lifestyles, any variation thereof becomes so easy to judge and becomes so easy to insert our own convictions on those points and then tell people that they're wrong for doing so. And so it's trying to recognize that, and I think that comes from reading the progression of anthropology and anthropological research. And I'm not trying to say that we've suddenly reached this golden era of anthropology where we no longer have biased accounts, biased reporting, but I do think that we are developing a culture in that research where people are attempting to recognize their own bias more, and that other people are actively seeking it out, actively trying to find and reevaluate problematic assumptions that will lead to sort of a skewed conclusion in research. All right, and I know that this video is getting pretty long, but I just wanted to end with a question. How specifically, or what are some specific ideas that you guys have for looking for and combating research bias, especially as we as anthropologists are starting to move into the world and we'll be doing our own research? What can we do to sort of be more cognizant of that pitfall?